There's a moment in life most people never talk about. It doesn't happen suddenly. There's no dramatic collapse, no cinematic breakdown, no warning sign. It's quieter than that, almost invisible. One day, you simply realize you don't feel happy anymore. Not excited, not joyful, not hopeful, just neutral, flat. Like your emotions downgraded to grayscale, while everyone else is still living in full color. And the scariest part, you can still smile when needed. You can still function. You can still pretend. But inside, it feels like something has been turned off. Like your emotional wiring is no longer connected to anything real. This isn't laziness. This isn't ingratitude. This isn't being dramatic. It's a psychological state that forms slowly, silently, and almost always in people who have carried too much for too long. People who had to grow up faster than they should have. People who were always the strong ones. People who learned early that showing emotions only leads to disappointment or judgment. So they trained themselves to suppress sadness. Then they suppressed anger. Then fear. Then anxiety. And eventually, they suppressed happiness too. Because you cannot selectively numb emotions. When you shut down the pain long enough, you also lose access to joy. This is the psychology of people who can't feel happy anymore. They didn't become empty overnight. They became empty because they kept surviving while never having a place to actually feel anything. And that's the twisted paradox. The people who seem the calmest, the strongest, the most collected are often the ones who feel the least inside. Not because they are broken, but because they adapted. And now the adaptation has become the prison. Because when you've spent years in survival mode, your nervous system stops believing the world is safe enough for happiness. It keeps you in a state of emotional lockdown. You can function, you can achieve, you can handle everything, except joy, except rest, except peace. Happiness isn't gone. It's buried under years of emotional self-defense. And this is where the story really begins. Because the moment you realize you can't feel happiness anymore, is the moment your mind is finally telling you the truth you've been avoiding. You've been carrying more than a human should carry. But you don't know how to stop. You don't know how to open up. You don't know how to let yourself feel again. You just know one thing. Life is moving forward. You are moving with it. But emotionally you're standing completely still. And that stillness is slowly becoming unbearable. There's a moment people rarely admit out loud. The moment they realize that happiness isn't hard to reach, it's unreachable. Not because life is terrible. Not because everything is falling apart. But because something inside them has quietly shut down. Like a room in the house of their mind that used to be full of light, now locked, dark, untouched. People who can't feel happy anymore don't wake up one day and suddenly lose all emotion. It happens slowly, quietly, almost politely. It begins with emotional fatigue. The kind where even small joys feel exhausting. The funny video doesn't land. The compliment doesn't register. The achievement feels like dust. They laugh, but it's mechanical. They smile, but it never reaches their eyes. They celebrate, but inside they feel nothing but the hollow sound of their own acting. Here's the part nobody understands unless they've lived it. It's not sadness. It's not depression in the dramatic sense. It's not crying or breaking down. It's the absence of both extremes. Like the emotional world has been put on mute. They don't hate life. They just can't feel it. And that's exactly what makes it terrifying. People around them say, try to be positive. Focus on good things. Do what makes you happy. But none of those words reach them. Because happiness has become a language they no longer speak. And deep down, they know the worst part. They used to feel everything so intensely. They used to be the type of people who laughed too loudly, loved too deeply, cried too easily. Emotional, sensitive, expressive. But after too many disappointments, too many betrayals, too many internal battles that no one ever saw, they lost access to their own joy. Not permanently, but enough to feel like something inside them has broken in a place they don't know how to reach. And so they shift into a survival mode that outsiders mistake for strength. They become calm, quiet, reasonable, hard to upset, hard to excite, hard to read. But internally, it's not peace, it's emotional shutdown. And here's the hidden truth. People who can't feel happy anymore often become the best performers in life. They work well, they function, they stay composed, they look stable, they make logical decisions. They keep everything in order because structure is the only thing that still feels real. Happiness doesn't move them, but responsibility does, duty does, routine does. Not because they're disciplined, but because they need something to fill the space where emotion used to live. They don't want pleasure, they want predictability. They don't chase joy, they chase control, because losing control is the one thing they still fear. And here's where it becomes dangerous. When you can't feel happiness, you stop believing you deserve it. This is the psychology of a person who isn't broken, but disconnected from themselves. A person who doesn't need cheering up, but reconnection. A person who doesn't need more noise, but a way back into their own inner world. And the deeper you look into their silence, the more you realize their numbness isn't a lack of emotion. It's a shield made of old wounds. And behind that shield, happiness is still there, just waiting for a moment when it finally feels safe to return. There is a moment quiet, almost invisible, when a person stops chasing happiness and starts chasing nothing at all. Not peace, not joy, not excitement, just emptiness. A comfortable numbness, a quiet room inside the mind where nothing hurts, but nothing lives either. Most people never notice this shift, but those who can't feel happy anymore know it all too well. It's the moment life becomes something you manage, not something you experience. And here's the uncomfortable psychological truth. Emotional numbness is not the absence of feelings, it's the mind's emergency shutdown system. When the brain decides that feeling nothing is safer than being hurt again, happiness becomes collateral damage. The three shutdown switches your mind uses, psychologists call them protective mechanisms, but people who live through them call them something else. Why am I like this? Why can't I get excited about anything? Why do I feel like I'm watching my life instead of living it? Let's break them down. 1. Emotional overload. Emotional silence. When someone feels too much for too long, stress, pressure, grief, disappointment, the nervous system hits the override button. Not because you're weak, but because you've been strong for too long. It's the same reason people stop crying. Not because the pain is gone, but because the body refuses to waste any more energy on hope. Happiness doesn't disappear. It gets buried under emotional debris. 2. Learned disappointment. If every time you reach for happiness, life slapped your hand away, your brain learns a brutal lesson. Don't reach at all. This is why some people stop celebrating good news, why they expect things to fall apart, why even moments of joy feel suspicious, temporary, fragile. Happiness starts to feel like a setup, like a joke you're tired of falling for. 3. The shadow self takes control. Everyone has a darker psychological twin. The version of you that whispers, don't get your hopes up, you'll just get hurt again. Why try? It won't matter. Most people can silence that voice, but people who can't feel happiness anymore, their shadow becomes the narrator of their entire life. Not because they chose it, but because the real self is exhausted. The secret people never tell you. People who can't feel happy anymore aren't emotionless. They aren't cold. They aren't broken. They are protecting something inside themselves, something life has hit too many times. You'll see it if you look closely. They laugh, but it doesn't reach their eyes. They say I'm fine too quickly. They stay busy so they don't have to think. They disappear into routine because routine doesn't ask anything of them. They didn't lose happiness. They locked it away, and they don't know where they put the key. There comes a moment, a quiet, terrifying moment, when a person who can't feel happiness anymore realizes something even darker. It's not just joy they don't feel, it's anything. The emotional spectrum that once had color now feels like a grayscale landscape, where every feeling is flattened, muted, drained. And what makes this state even more brutal is that the world keeps demanding enthusiasm, energy, passion, while inside, everything feels frozen. People who reach this stage don't usually get here suddenly. It's a slow decline, a gradual erosion of emotional responsiveness, and it often begins with emotional burnout. Not the kind people joke about, in burned out from work, but deep psychological burnout. The kind that happens when your emotional output has been far greater than your emotional income. For too long. You gave too much. You worried too much. You carried too much. You endured too much. And eventually something inside just shuts down. When the nervous system hits its limits, it doesn't scream. It goes silent. That's the version of numbness people rarely understand. Because from the outside, you can still function. You still talk. You still smile. You still exist. But internally, it feels like you're watching life from behind a thick sheet of glass. Untouched, unaffected, unengaged. And the worst part, people around you assume you're fine. Because numbness is invisible. A person who can't feel happy anymore becomes an expert at maintaining the illusion. They laugh at jokes. They show up where expected. They say, "I'm okay," because the truth feels too heavy, too complicated, too exhausting to explain. And when you feel numb long enough, your brain begins to forget what happiness even feels like. Not in a dramatic way, in a subtle, insidious way. Like forgetting the taste of a childhood meal you loved. You remember that it existed, but you can't recreate the sensation. That's what emotional numbness does. It disconnects you from the living memory of joy. And here's the psychological truth. People who can't feel happiness anymore usually carry one of these burdens. 1. Chronic emotional suppression. Years of pushing feelings down until the system simply stops producing them. 2. Long-term high-functioning anxiety. Living in survival mode so long that the brain never switches back to safe. 3. Repeated disappointment. The kind that rewires the brain to expect nothing, so it won't get hurt again. 4. Identity fatigue. Playing a role instead of living a life. 5. Hidden depression. Not sadness, but emptiness. Exhaustion, disconnection. You see, sadness is at least something. Numbness is the absence of life itself. And yet, underneath that numb surface, there is usually a person who is still quietly fighting. Still hoping, somewhere deep inside, that something will spark again. That something will wake them up. Because no one truly wants to live a life they can't feel. The tragedy is that people who lose their ability to feel happiness rarely ask for help. Not because they don't want it, but because they don't know how to explain a pain that feels like nothingness. How do you describe a void? How do you tell someone that the hardest part of your life is something they can't see? If you've ever felt like your happiness has been hollowed out from the inside, like someone turned off a switch you can't find anymore, then listen carefully, because this final part is the one people rarely talk about. Not the pain, not the numbness, but the rebirth that hides underneath it. Because here's the truth, no one likes to say out loud. People who can't feel happy anymore aren't broken. They're overloaded, underprotected, and emotionally exhausted from carrying a life that was too heavy for too long. The real reason they feel nothing: most people think emotional numbness is a sign of weakness. But psychologically, it's the opposite. It's the mind's last defense mechanism. When someone has been wounded too many times, when hope kept turning into disappointment, when joy always had a cost, the brain eventually says, "Enough. If happiness hurts, I will remove it." Numbness isn't the absence of emotion. It's the shield covering all the emotions that were too strong to keep feeling. Underneath it, fear, loneliness, exhaustion, unprocessed grief, and a quiet, desperate desire to finally breathe. The paradox of numb people: they don't show their emptiness. They hide it under routines, humor, competence, perfectionism, silence. They smile. They function. They nod at the right moments. Because people who can't feel happiness anymore learn something brutal early in life. The world rewards those who pretend, so they become masters of pretending. But inside, they aren't living. They're maintaining. Why they feel like they've lost themselves. Numbness creates a psychological distance between the person and their own identity. They stop recognizing their reflection. Their passions fade. Their desires blur. They start saying things like, "I don't even know what I want anymore. Nothing makes sense. I don't feel like myself." Everything feels muted. Because when emotions shut down, the self shuts down with them. The brain cannot selectively numb sadness without numbing joy at the same time. It's all or nothing. And often, it becomes nothing. The turning point they don't see coming. Here's the part that almost no one realizes. The moment you notice you can't feel happiness anymore is the moment healing has already begun. Why? Because numb people spend years dissociating, distracting, and running. And the moment they finally see their own emptiness, they've stepped out of autopilot. Awareness is painful, but it's the first crack in the wall. And light enters through cracks. The way back to feeling again, you don't thaw all at once. You thaw slowly. Emotion returns in tiny ways. A song that suddenly hits. A memory that burns. A moment of anger, or softness, or longing. A tear that finally falls after years of dryness. A sudden urge to change something in your life. These are signs that the emotional system is waking up. Psychology calls this re-emergence. It's the process of reconnecting with your authentic self after years of survival mode. The truth they need to hear: people who can't feel happy anymore aren't doomed. They're tired. They're overloaded. They're emotionally frozen, not emotionally dead. And frozen things melt. Sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but always eventually. Your inability to feel happiness is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your unfreezing. One day, you will laugh again without forcing it. You will feel excited again without pretending. You will wake up and realize the heaviness lifted when you weren't even looking. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because you finally became real again. And that is the kind of happiness that actually lasts.